just want to say we're glad that you've chosen to worship here with us at South Florida Avenue. Before we begin, I didn't hear these things in the announcement, so I'm going to go ahead and make some preliminary remarks before we begin the sermon. But Brother John Thomas was baptized last Sunday morning. Glad to have him with us. You know, John met Melvin Otey, who speaks on the lectureship at the hotel there where the speakers stay, and Melvin had a brief Bible study with him and encouraged him to come. He studied with Brother Terrence Dindy and myself and decided last week that he would obey the gospel. And so one plants, one waters, and we're glad God gave the increase for John. We're glad he's here. And one more remark before we begin. Sister Debbie Bush, one of our shut-ins. You may not know Debbie. She's been a member here a long time, but she's had a lot of health troubles and things like that. I often get to visit with Debbie, build a good relationship and friendship with her, and I'm glad she's able to be here this morning. So when you get the chance at the close of worship, tell Debbie how glad you are that she's here as well. One doctor said, an optimist sees the glass as half full, a pessimist sees the glass as half empty, but the chronic complainer sees a glass that's slightly chipped, holding a cup of water which isn't as cold as it should be because it's probably from the tap when I asked for bottled water, and also there's a smudge on the rim of the cup, which means it wasn't cleansed properly, and I probably will get food poisoning. Why do these things always happen to me? It's a lot easier to complain and to gripe and to be negative than it is to be positive, to be a person that sees things on the bright side. I believe it was Mark Twain. He's often quoted as saying, it's not the parts of the Bible that I don't understand that trouble me. It's the parts that I do understand that trouble me. And I think we could agree, at least in part, with that. The parts of the Bible that are very simple that we can read and we say, I know what that means, that doesn't make them any easier to obey. And that's true with Philippians 2:14. Paul says, do all things without murmuring and disputing. That's the old King James, but it could be translated. Do all things without complaining and arguing, that you may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God, without rebuke in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation among whom you shine as lights in the world. Can you do all things without complaining and arguing? It's difficult to do, but what you read in Philippians 2:14 is what we all must do. If we're going to conform to God's will, it doesn't really matter how difficult it is, we still have to do it. This morning I want to talk about how do we cut complaining out of our lives. What does the Bible say we should do? But before we do that, I want to say these are two things I'm not suggesting this morning. We don't need to cut these out of our lives. These wouldn't qualify as complaining or violating Philippians 2:14. The first one is grieving. You know, Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 4:13, I'm writing these things to you so that you won't be ignorant and that you won't sorrow as those who have no hope. And while Christians do grieve, we don't do it as individuals without hope. And sometimes in grief, there's the crying out to God, there's frustration, but that wouldn't violate Philippians 2:14. The second thing that wouldn't violate this passage would be to point out error, things that people do that are mistaken, that are wrong. Somebody might say, well, he's doing that wrong, or they're teaching something that's false, or this is a mistake. And you remember, you can't complain, so you can't say anything about that. That wouldn't be what Paul's talking about in Philippians 2:14. There are a host of Bible passages. I'm thinking about a whole chapter, Matthew 23, where Jesus upbraids or rebukes the Pharisees and scribes, and he says, woe to you, because you do these things incorrectly. Or when Paul came to Athens in Acts 17, his spirit was stirred within him because he saw the entire city given over to idolatry. Sometimes things are incorrect, and we need to point that out. That wouldn't violate this injunction by Paul here, this command. But some things do. Complaining is defined, at least the English word complaining is defined as to speak about something that's dissatisfactory, that which annoys. Collins Dictionary says it is the habitual grumbling. When I read that definition, I thought, I guess it's like a vocal garbage disposal. Always on and rumbling, and usually about something negative, something that I don't like the way that it's going. In the Old Testament, the word murmuring, we're going to look at some occasions where that happens. It has this idea to mutter something on the lips. The four words that are used in the New Testament to be defined as murmur or complain, they deal with this idea to speak under one's breath in a low tone. The word Philippians 2:14, it's what they call an onomatopoeia. That is, the word itself sounds like a grumble. It sounds like something that an individual would say if they were grumbling or complaining. One lexicon defined the word in Philippians 2:14 as to speak behind one's back silently. I'm just frustrated, I'm just annoyed, and so I complain. This morning I want to talk about why it is that we complain. Why do we do that? Look at some Old Testament examples of people that complained and what God thought about that. How did Jesus deal with people that complain? And then where we're going to end it is, how do we get this out of our system? In a world where we just gripe and complain incessantly, what do we need to do? So let's begin. Number one, why do we complain? You could summarize it this way. We haven't learned what Paul said he did in Philippians 4, 10, and 11. In Philippians 4 and verse 10, Paul says, I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at the last your cares flourish for me again. Also in this you were careful, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in respect of want, but I've learned in whatever state I am, therewith to be content. Paul was able to be content in all circumstances, and so he didn't complain. Content doesn't mean that I don't wish or even desire that things or people or individuals improve or get better. But what it does mean is this. I will not gripe and sulk and throw a temper tantrum until those things take place. It's what John the Immerser told the people in Luke 3 and verse 14. When the soldiers came to John to be baptized, they said, what is it that we need to do? And John said, among other things, be content with your wages. Be happy with what you have. Godliness with contentment is great gain, 1 Timothy 6 and verse 6. And until we learn to be content, we'll always complain. If we just sit back and listen to ourselves complain, you'll see that what is at the heart of all complaints really is just an over-infatuation with ourselves. Some of it is so nonsensical, it doesn't even really make sense on why we would do such a thing. The Huffington Post had an article, and this was the title, 19 idiotic but very real complaints made about travel. They made them to Thomas and Cook Vacations, I guess this company, and these were some of the 19 that people made as they traveled, complaints that they actually wrote into the company. I was in Spain and I'm frustrated. I can't believe my cab driver spoke Spanish. We had to wait in line for the boat, and why didn't anybody tell us there was no air conditioning? Hey, the kids had fish in the water when they went to swim, and that really scared them. And there's a host of others that individuals just make complaining on and on again, just being unsatisfied with the basic necessities of life. A man named Will Bowen wrote a book about how to get complaints out of the world, a complaint-free world. And he said there are 5 reasons why people complain. And he illustrated it with the acronym with the letters that spell GRIPE, G-R-I-P-E. And here's what he said. Number 1, people complain to get attention. People complain so that they might, see, all of us have this desire to be noticed or to be acknowledged, and sometimes we'll even complain to get it. 1 Corinthians 10:24 says, let no man seek but every man another's wealth. But sometimes I complain because I want people to pay me attention. You know how hard it is to do this job? You see how difficult it is being me and where I live and the things I'm struggling with? And so we complain so that people might notice us and that we might get attention. Sometimes it's to remove responsibility. It wasn't my fault. I can't do that. Nope. You know why that failed? Well, this is the reason, and we complain and make excuses. In Daniel chapter 2, you remember King Nebuchadnezzar goes to the magicians and he says, would you tell me my dream? And they begin to complain to remove responsibility. This is supposed to be their job. They say, no king has ever asked that of his servants. That's impossible. No one can do it. It can't be done. And they complain to get out of their responsibility. What about this one? To inspire envy. Oh, if I was in charge, things would be a lot better. You know why things aren't working around here? Because they don't know what they're doing. And if I was the boss, if I were king for a day, if I was an elder in this church, oh, we'd be doing so much better. That's what Absalom did in 2 Samuel 15, 1-4. He sat by the gate, and as people came through, Absalom would say to him, what's your problem? What's your grievance? And they would tell him, and he would say, no good king. You know, if I were king, you wouldn't have these problems. And they would bow down and worship Absalom. And sometimes we complain to inspire envy, to suggest that we could do it better if we were king for a day. Sometimes it's for power. Proverbs 16 and verse 28 talks about a murmurer that separates chief friends. And then in the last place, to excuse our poor performance. Oh, the sun was in my eyes. I couldn't see it. You know, it's your fault I'm late because of X, Y, or Z. That's what Aaron said in Exodus 32 when Moses confronts him. He complains and he says, you know these people, they're set on mischief. Or Saul in 1 Samuel 15, Saul says, well, it's the people's fault. And they didn't do what they were supposed to do. And they brought back all of this stuff. And we complain, in summary, to get the focus and attention off of us. Humility suggests that I could make mistakes, that other people aren't perfect, and I need to be patient and bear with them. And be content at least with an individual giving their very best. But sometimes that's not enough. But number 2, as it relates to complaining, notice some people that did this in the Old Testament. There have been few people as blessed as the Old Testament Israelites, but equally as constant in their complaints. Deuteronomy 4 and verse 7, the Israelites say this. Moses actually said this about them. Who on earth has God so close to them that they can call on God and he hears them? Nobody. Nobody was as close to God as the Old Testament Israelites. But you know what Psalm 106 and verse 25 says? They murmured constantly. And God turned away in his wrath toward them. He didn't hear them because they rebelled and murmured. You see, they were blessed abundantly, but the Israelites, if there's anything we know about them, it's this. They always complain. Let me just refresh your memory about the history of the Israelite people. You remember they were in Egyptian bondage and captivity, and they cried out to God, Exodus 2:23 through 25, and they went up to God because of their bondage, and God said, I remember a covenant that I made with Abraham, Isaac, and with Jacob, and I'm going to send Moses to deliver these folks out of Egyptian bondage. And after 10 miraculous plagues, the final being the death of the firstborn in Egypt, and deliverance on dry ground through the Red Sea. You remember what they did when they get on the other side of that? Exodus 15 and verse 1, they sing the song of Moses. The Lord has triumphed gloriously, thrown the rider and his chariots into the sea. They rejoice, but it doesn't last long. After that, the only thing that Israel seems to be able to do well is complain about their circumstances. Notice a few of the complaints, and this isn't exhaustive. They complain for water. At Mara, you remember when they get there in Exodus 15, they say there's no water there, and they complain to Moses, hey, there's nothing for us to drink. The water here is bitter. God says, Moses, throw down a tree into the water, and then it'll make the water so that the people can drink it, so that they can digest it. God just brought them through the Red Sea. And the first thing they can complain about is this: we're thirsty. The very next chapter, in Exodus 16, they say, we're hungry. We want food. God, could you give us some bread? God says, okay, Moses, would you mind getting these people some manna so that they can have something to eat? In Exodus 17, it continues. And you know what they're complaining about? Water again at Rephidim. They want more water. And Moses cries out to God, and God says, Moses, would you strike the rock, and it'll bring forth water, and then these people can have something to drink. In Numbers 11, we don't even know what they're complaining about in verses 1 through 3. The Bible just says they complained against Moses. God had enough, and he destroyed them through a plague. And then in verses 4 through 6, well, they started again, and they say, you remember the leeks and the onions and all the good things, Moses? You brought us out here to die, and they're complaining about food. Yet again, they don't stop there. They actually say to Moses in Numbers 14, we wish we would have died in Egypt. It's terrible to be out here in this wilderness, Moses. You promised us great things. God said he was going to do a lot of things for us. None of those things have shown up. We just wish we would die out here in this wilderness. They complain about water again at Kadesh. And of course, in Numbers 21 and verse 5, you know what they're complaining about? Water and food again. God blessed these people more than they could ever deserve. And all he heard from them for the most part was how bad their lives were, how hard they had it. Woe unto us, because we're in the wilderness with nothing to eat or nothing to drink. And they complain over and over again. The psalmist says in Psalm 79, about verse 25 down through 29, while the food was in their mouths, God struck them and punished them and just overwhelmed them with the manna because they continued to complain. And we might sit on our spiritual high horses and look at Old Testament Israel and say, how could they do that? How could they complain after God had done so much for them? How could they complain over and over again after God had blessed them abundantly? But when we really look at ourselves, Matthew 7 and verse 1, judge not that you be not judged, for with what judgment you use, it'll be measured to you. And why beholdest thou the mote in your brother's eye when there's a plank in your own eye? Are we really any better off than they are? The World Happiness Report, it's a 136-page document. People research the income of countries, life expectancy and health, social support that individuals receive, generosity, and they rank the countries on who's the happiest in the world. You know who was number one? And it was Finland in 2019. America, with all of her blessings and benefits, was at number 19. She's down one spot from 2018 and 5 spots from 2017. The most blessed people who've ever lived in all the world. And the survey says we're professional pouters. We're not happy. Though we have finances and wealth and health and all of these various things, it's not enough, because for the chronic complainer, it's never enough. You don't have enough manna and water and blessings and miracles and signs to please the person who's never happy. But this is more than just, hey, pick your chin up, be happy, don't complain. Philippians 2:14. Throughout Scripture, some of God's most harsh criticisms or wrathful sayings come down on those who always complain. In Jude 16, Jude speaks about false teachers, and he says they are murmurers and complainers. The unthankful of Romans 1 and verse 21 and 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, they're unthankful. We don't need to be like Old Testament Israel. See, in 1 Corinthians 10, this is what Paul says. Neither murmur as they also murmured and were destroyed of the destroyer. Now, all of these things happen to them for our examples, and they're written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world have come. Paul's saying, learn from them and don't complain. How often do we complain? It's too hot in this building. It's too cold in this building. Why is he talking so fast? He's not talking fast enough. Why was that prayer so long? And why won't my husband do what I think he should do? And why won't my wife behave as I want her to behave? And why do we start at this time? And why don't we start at this time? You know, he should have said this, or why didn't he acknowledge me? I'm new. He didn't say anything when I brought somebody to be baptized. See, we often complain over and over again, and we sound just like Old Testament Israel, and we forget how blessed we really are. The big mistake for Israel, there were several. Their complaints, it made them lack faith in God. They didn't think God could do it. They didn't think God could provide for them as he promised. In Exodus 14, Moses tells them, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. These Egyptians you see, you'll never see them again. Their complaints were contagious, and so are ours. When they went into Canaan and they said, hey, there are giants in the land, we can't do it. You know what the rest of the camp said? There were only 12 people that went into Canaan. The entire army, with the exception of a few, said, we can't do it. Your complaints are the same way. You say, everybody in this family complains. Look at yourself. Everybody on this job is so negative, and they complain, and they're so critical. You work there too. And this neighborhood is just so negative, and people are set about with complaints. I would look inwardly. It made them short-sighted. I've read Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. You have too. Listen, I don't remember the leeks and the onions. I don't remember the Egyptian golden corral that they often speak of in the wilderness when they say, oh, we were fed so good, we ate so sumptuously every day. Where was it? You see, when you start to complain, it'll make the past look better than it really was and the future more promising than it really may be. And you might start to say about the present, I just can't wait to get out of here. I can't wait till I'm older. I wish I was younger. You see, you'll forget all of the blessings that God's bestowed on you. It'll make you impatient. Oh, the food was coming, but never fast enough. And Canaan was just up the street, but not close enough. And the water, Moses had it coming, but it just didn't come fast enough. There were never enough blessings to satisfy these people. And Paul says in Philippians 2, don't go down that street. Don't be a chronic complainer, be better. One more before we get practical about how to cut it out of our lives, and that is, how did Jesus handle complainers? I don't know if before this lesson I ever really thought about how often Jesus dealt with people that complained and how often people came to Jesus complaining. But it is a fascinating study to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and read about the people, the various situations who came to Jesus with their complaints. And 1 Peter 2:21 says he's our example. And he's our example in everything. And even in this area, that is, when I read these accounts, I want to see what would Jesus say to me about my complaints, but also, how do I need to help others? Jesus never let people wallow in their complaints. Didn't really matter how hard their life was. Jesus was sympathetic and kind, but he never let people start to feel sorry for themselves. In Luke 10:38 through 42, he comes to Bethany. He's in the house of Mary and Martha. You remember? Mary's at his feet learning. Martha's serving, and she's doing a good deed. But she says to Jesus, would you have my sister come and help me? She starts to complain, and Jesus says, Martha, Martha, you're troubled about many things. Mary's chosen the good part, which won't be taken away from her. Jesus was saying, hey, we're not going to complain. In John 5, he meets a crippled man who's been there 38 years, an impotent man, the old King James says. Jesus says to him in John 5 and verse 6, do you want to be healed? And you know what the man starts to do? He starts complaining. Well, I have nobody when the water's troubled to put me in. No, Jesus didn't ask him that, but he starts complaining. Jesus says, rise, pick up your bed and walk. No complaining allowed. Everybody who came to Jesus in the gospel accounts with a complaint, every one of them, without exception, Jesus turns him or her away with this response, complaint denied. Sometimes we think it's justified in spiritual things. I'm complaining because these folks aren't where they ought to be spiritually. And I want them to be better and do better, and they should be more in depth like me. And Jesus dealt with the same thing. John's disciples in Matthew 9, they say, hey, we fast. What about your disciples? And Jesus said, no, the time will come when they'll do it. Or Luke 19, Zacchaeus comes to his house. They murmur against him and say, this man went to be the guest with a person that was a sinner. And Jesus ate with sinners in Luke 15 and verse 2. And they murmur and complain. Every time people complain to Jesus about the spiritual level of other people, this is what Jesus says in summary. Mind your own business, and they'll get there in time. Over and over again, Jesus says, hey, I'm doing something with these individuals. That's really none of your concern. There are other occasions when people come to Jesus and they want him to play referee with them. Look at Luke chapter 12. Look at Luke chapter 12 and notice verse 13. This man wants Jesus to be his financial arbiter between him and his brother. And he comes to Jesus in Luke 12 and verse 13 and he says, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. And Jesus' response to him is, who made me a judge between you and your brother? Take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life does not consist in the abundance of things of which he possesses. Jesus' point again, don't complain. More than just rebuke people for complaining, though, Jesus set an example, didn't he? I love the song Jason led us in right before the sermon, and how we often complain and how Jesus could respond. I know there's some poetic license in the song, but I believe the scriptures bear it out. He never said a word when he could have. Mark 15 and verse 5, they spit at him, they hurl all manner of insults. Pilate marveled because Jesus never said a word in response. When he was reviled, he reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to God who judges righteously. He didn't say, my life's so hard I don't deserve this. And my mom, they accused her of things before I was born. Those things weren't true. I did signs. I helped those people. How could they? He never complained. He lived his life under this motto and this banner, and this is how he lived, the complaint-free life. Not my will, but your will be done, Matthew 26:39. And it kept him from complaining. And if we live like that, the same will be true for us. Now, this is how we're going to end this sermon. Turn your Bible to Philippians chapter 2, and I just want to do 3 brief things on how we can cut it out of our lives. We can look at why we complain, and we can look at Old Testament Israel and see what their problem was, and even at how Jesus dealt with complainers. But here we are in 2020, and what can we do to cut it out of our lives? How can we remove complaining from our lives? 3 things. Number 1, do what you can and must do. Before Paul ever gets to verse 14 and verse 12, he says, wherefore, my beloved brethren, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with much fear and trembling. You see, Paul says there are certain things that you can do and must do, and before you complain, do what you can. Maya Angelou said, when you run up against things that you don't like, you should change them. And if you can't change those things, well, change the way you think about them, but don't complain. There are certain things that every one of us can do, and then there are other things that we can't do. The things that you can control, the things that you can change, do those things. See, sometimes we complain about the things that are out of our reach. God's not holding you or me accountable for the things we can't do, but for the things which we can. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, and then leave the rest to what God can do. What can you do that you're not doing? What do you complain about that you can control, and are you doing those things? The one talent man had a lot of complaints in Matthew 25. You're a hard man. I can't serve you. I buried the talent. He never did a thing. And sometimes we're very similar to him. We've got a lot of complaints, but there are things that we can do, and we're stagnant in that, and we don't do that. If you want to cut complaining out of your life, when you feel frustrated or annoyed with circumstances, say this. Okay, here are the circumstances. I don't like it. What can I do about it? And am I going to do that with every fiber of my being to work out my salvation, to do my part? But number 2, remember what God is doing. Verse 13, for it is God that works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. It's not just you and me. God works as well. God works in us for his good pleasure, according to this passage. He works all things after the counsel of his own will, Ephesians 1 and verse 11. All things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are the called according to his purpose, Romans 8 and verse 28. After you do everything that you can do, look upward and remember that God's working too. Ryan Newman drove in the Daytona 500, I believe it was a week ago now, and he was in a scary car accident, and it reminded many people of Dale Earnhardt 19 years ago. And to the surprise of many, just a few days after that, there was a post on social media or some sort of him and his daughter walking out of the hospital, and people just can't believe he's still alive. They interviewed a man named Ryan McGee. He's a sports writer for ESPN on NPR, and they said, what's the difference? How did he survive? How did he make it? And he started listing down the things. He said Mr. Newman was in a seat, fitted perfectly for him. And his cockpit was a lot bigger than the one that was surrounding Dale 19 years ago. And he hit up against what we call this soft curve, and it's designed to absorb the impact. All of these things, though available in the days of Earnhardt, were not mandated as they are now. And he concluded with this statement: those very things are the things that kept Mr. Newman alive. See, you and I, we complain about our circumstances, but there's a God above in heaven There are brethren below. There's the providence of God out before us. It's not only what God's doing behind the scenes, but what God's doing ahead of the scenes. And those things are perfectly outfitted so that we might make it through life, though not unscathed, definitely saved and in the loving hands of our God. Remember that God's working. He worked with Joseph, Genesis 50 and verse 20. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good to save much people alive as it is this day. He worked with Esther, Esther 4:14. She was in the kingdom for such a time as that, and he worked through Jesus for us. He made him to be sin for us, who knew no sin, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. You got a problem complaining? Have you thought about what God's doing in life? The last one, do not dim your light. Paul doesn't just say, hey, don't complain, that's bad. It doesn't just annoy people and disrespect deity, it dims our light. Look at verse 14. Do all things without murmuring and disputing, that you might be blameless and harmless, the sons of God, without rebuke in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. And he says that I want you to adorn the word of Christ, that I might not have run in vain or labored in vain. Paul says, I want you to remember that when you complain, other people see it and it doesn't attract them to Christianity. Maybe our complaints about politics and our neighborhood and minimum wage and everything going on around us is not the spiritual magnet we sometimes behave like it is. Maybe they look at us and they say, those people really hate it here and they can't wait to leave. I know Jesus came to earth. He knew he wasn't going to stay. I get that we're getting out of this world. This world is not our home. But when Jesus was around, people really wanted him to be there. Zechariah 8:23, we've heard the Lord is on your side. We'll go with you. The lives we live are supposed to attract people and not repel them. They're supposed to say, those people, though persecuted and beset by the same things as us, and often more so because of their faith, are the happiest people in the world. I want to know what it is about them. And then we get to respond in hope. We need to be people that shine our light, but our complaints often work against that, counter to it, and dim our light. And nobody wants to hear what it is that we have to say. You know it's illegal to record somebody in Florida without their permission. You can't just record somebody and later produce it. That's why you call these companies and they sometimes will say, this call is being recorded for quality purposes. Well, not really. Quality purposes plus some. What if we were recorded for Christian assurance purposes? What if people were recording our conversations to see if we're really all that we claim to be? Or would they find us constantly in violation of Philippians 2:14, doing all things with murmuring and arguing and complaining, never satisfied, as if God's forsaken us and we bear all of the world's problems? Paul says, do everything without murmuring and arguing so that you can be the children of God. I agree with Twain, and maybe you do too. It's not the parts of the Bible that I don't understand that give me the most trouble. It's the parts that I do understand. I guess the plan of salvation, you could say that it's simple. Believe that Jesus is the Christ, John 8:24. Turn from sin, Acts 17 and verse 30. All men everywhere must repent. Confess Jesus as the Son of God and allow your body to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of sins. Rise to walk in newness of life. Because of God's grace, that's possible. Everybody in the world can do it. I guess there'll be millions, maybe billions, trillions of people separated from God in eternity that have never done that. They've heard it, they've spurned against it, they've kicked against it, argued against it, they've never done it. And they'll spend an eternity complaining about how God's grace wasn't bright enough to be seen, close enough to be grasped. Nobody ever did enough to point them toward Jesus. And just like he did on earth, he'll do in eternity. Complaint denied. Maybe you need to obey the gospel. Become a Christian. Put away complaining and realize you do have something to be hopeful and happy about, and that is one day our citizenship's in heaven, Philippians 3:20, and we'll get out of this world and go to the one that God's prepared for us. If you're a Christian and you see Philippians 2:14 hit you between the eyes like it hit me this week, writing this sermon, I had to repent several times just thinking about what this passage teaches, grumbling under my voice, complaining about life circumstances, frustrated about things I wish were better, not doing all that I can. Maybe you need to do that. Maybe you can do it right there in your seat. You know what the Bible teaches on this, and you just need to change your attitude and develop the attitude that Paul gives us in Philippians 2:14. If you need the prayers of the church in a public way, one of our elders will be standing down here to receive you as your shepherds. You can come now as together we stand and as we sing. I swear.